How many of us in the room, and just need a show of hands, there's nothing too scary just yet, but how many of us see communications as the main part of our job in our daily lives? That's encouraging. It's amazing how often I ask that question and I get very few hands. And the reason why I get very few hands occasionally is because it's often seen as somebody else's job. It's seen as the communications department's job. It's seen as the marketing department's job. It's seen as, in sales organizations, the sales department's job. But in actual fact, as Mukesh rightly said in his introduction, we're all communicators, right? And that's never more true than of an organization such as the Red Cross. And Red Cross Red Crescent is effectively a communications, or should effectively become a communications machine. Because everything that you do is dependent on being able to generate impact and influence around the world from your stakeholders. So another question. How many of us have been in scary communication situations? And how many of us find communications daunting or challenging from time to time? From time to time, or always? That's not uncommon. I'm with you. You know, when I'm faced with cameras, or if I've been required to be a spokesperson for an organisation where there's been a hostile journalist, or where there's been an issue that has been difficult to discuss, I've also been scared, and I communicate for a living. And there was a study done by Harvard a number of years ago, which many of you might already know of, which asked CEOs and senior managers of a number of top companies in the US, what were their 10 greatest fears? Fear number 1 was speaking in public. Fear number 2 was speaking to the media. Death was number 9. Which I think gives you a feeling for how communications is seen generally. It's generally seen as a fairly scary thing to do. But you know, there are lots of skills that we're going to cover over the next 60 minutes that will hopefully take some of that fear away from you. You know, I always remind myself at this point not to put builds into PowerPoint slides. But anyway, the first thing that we're going to look at is the golden rules of communications. We're going to look at what makes great communicators great. And we're also going to look at the skills that are as applicable to you as a parent speaking to your 12-year-old son to get him to stop pulling the ears of the dog, as it is as applicable to speaking to stakeholders and high-level influencers. And the skills that I'm going to discuss will cover just about every format of communications that you'll be involved in, from face-to-face discussions and negotiations, through to writing, through to interview skills in front of the media. These skills, these fundamental communication skills, are something that will cut across every form of communications format and content. Because after all, communication is a basic, fundamental human need. And I'd like to think that we've moved on slightly in terms of our sophistication since the days of the cavemen. It's not always true from my experience, but anyway, the fact of the matter is that since time immemorial, we've all needed to communicate to get what we want. And one of the most misunderstood things about communication is the dynamic of communication. It has to be two-way. If I just stand here and talk at you, I might as well literally pick up a club and hit you over the head until you agree with what I'm saying. It's far easier. Not only is it a fundamental requirement, but it actually makes your job easier as a communicator to understand the relationship between yourself and the person that you're communicating with. And so far more important than talking is listening. Without listening, you're not communicating. And listening has to be active. It has to be engaging. It has to ask questions of your audience so that you get the information and the data that you need to be able to communicate effectively. So if questions are our friend, as I say here, you should encourage them. And in that spirit, let me just ask, from those of you that said that you've had communications challenges in the past, what types of challenges have you had? What types of challenges or successes have you had? We've got some microphones either side of the audience. So have we got anybody who'd like to share some of their experiences with us of communicating?
I'm senior officer in the Information Systems Department, and as many of you in the information systems, so there are some situations where it's very difficult, and as you know, if the email is not working or the network is down, this is a situation where the communication skills have to be well prepared in advance. So we can quote different examples, but maybe some of you know when there is a governing board and the printer is not working and you're asking the service desk, and you know that we have our colleagues that are working now, and they're also trained in facing this kind of situation, so ensuring that everything will be okay, despite the fact that they're themselves sometimes scared about what has happened.
I'm currently working for logistics, and I'm in charge of communication. I have been in communication business for 18 years, and the time when I really saw communication, talking to media as a challenge, was when I was working as spokesperson for US ambassador in Armenia. This is my country. And actually, on your list of ranking, maybe I would put talking to media as the first threat. Yeah, and this was why I saw it as a challenge, because when you talk to media, any mistake in that particular case, it could not only be communication mistake, but a serious problem in the relationship of two countries. So there were some challenges there.
Absolutely, there's a hell of a lot at stake when you're dealing with the media, because you're not just talking to a cameraman, you're not just talking to a journalist, you're talking to his entire world and his entire audience and universe. So that's absolutely right. How many of us deal with media communication on a regular basis? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Interesting. Okay. So it sounds like there's a range of challenges and experiences in the room of communications. We're going to get on to a few of the tips that we've developed at Pinnacle for helping communicators to become better at what they do. And there are really 3 main areas that you need to focus on. And if you're not doing any one of these 3 things, frankly, you shouldn't be approaching communications. So before you approach any communications project, I would urge you to make sure you do these 3 things. Prepare and plan. And we'll go into that in some detail in a second. Understand who you're talking to. And these things sound so simple, they sound cliche, right? It sounds like it's so obvious. Why is it even up on a PowerPoint slide? But I'll go into the detail of what we actually mean behind those words in a second. And then think about your delivery. Think about tone of voice. Think about body language. Think about using the language that of the person that you're communicating with. And use subtle tools and tricks, again, which we'll take you through before the end of this morning, to make sure that you're delivering a message with impact. So, preparation and planning. Now, as I said, the IFRC has an enormous number of audiences to communicate with, each of whom have different needs, different channels which they're active in, different ways of communicating with them. You've also got a diverse range of messages and content, everything from humanitarian messages through to donation, financial messages, messages about the brand, the mission, vision, the values, and Strategy 2020. It's important that as communicators, we're all on the same page as far as the messaging is concerned. And again, with an international organization, that in itself is sometimes a challenge. I'm not going to go into the specifics of messaging and content for the IFRC. That's another week's worth of training. So we're going to look today specifically at the tools and tricks of the communicator. First of all, make sure your communication is outcome-centric. So when you're planning and preparing to communicate, decide on the following 3 things. What do I want this communication to achieve? Now, if I'm writing a press release, I might decide, well, the reason for writing this press release is to get an article into a magazine, or to secure an interview, or to somehow influence an audience's mind. But is that actually what the job in hand is there to do? Is the objective actually to get that press release printed verbatim, or to get it to appear in print anywhere? Or is that more about the organisational objectives that are behind that press release and behind that message? Is it more about getting my press release published, or is it more about increasing donations as a result of my press release being published? And until you understand the absolute reason for why you're communicating, you shouldn't be starting the communication at all. So, first of all, what do I want this communication to achieve? Not just from the communication objectives point of view, but from the organisation, the movement's point of view. And how am I going to know if this is working as we're going along? You know, it's important when you communicate in any format, whether you're speaking to somebody face-to-face in person, whether you're delivering a lecture or a speech, or whether you're writing a press release, it's important to know, once you've started the delivery, whether it's working. So you need to be able to gauge reaction to the communication. And the only way that you can do that, again, is by asking questions and eliciting feedback and response. And then finally, how will I know if it's achieved the objective? Well, unless you've done number 1, you can't possibly do number 3. So always identify the objectives before you start communicating. And who to talk to and when. This is an interesting exercise, if the build works. Okay, we'll do it on paper instead. We've got a number of techniques. As we saw, we've got an extremely diverse range of people to communicate with and subject areas to cover. And the best way to communicate, even if you're communicating with entire organisations or entire populations or entire countries, the best way to communicate is for the recipient to feel as though you're speaking to him or to her directly and uniquely. And the way to do that is by segmenting your audience, by breaking your massive ranges of audiences down into smaller groups that you treat in certain ways. So we've got a number of tools at our fingertips, and you'll find these in your packs. The first one is the influence and interest grid. And if I could ask for my assistant for this time. Thank you. And the interest and influence grid gives you a way of mapping out those people that you should be spending time speaking to and where you should be placing your priorities in terms of communication. So before this session, I asked Susie to map onto a whole stack of post-it notes the audience groups that you as the Red Cross are regularly communicating with. And what we're going to do is just spend a couple of minutes plotting these onto the interest and influence grid. So we've got interest along the bottom, low to high, influence along the left axis, low to high. And what we're going to do is go through some of these and just start plotting them onto this grid. And you'll see the pattern that starts to emerge. So, first, donor governments. Who would like to offer a suggestion as to where donor governments should go? And the objective, sorry, what I should have said was each one of these grids needs to be tied to a specific objective. So the objective in this case is general awareness and general positive attitude, creating general positive attitude towards the IFRC. So in terms of that objective, where would you place donor governments? Any suggestions? Sorry? High influence, low interest. Does everybody agree with that? Donor governments.
High interest, high influence, because they wouldn't be donors if they were not interested.
High interest, high influence. How do you ensure that they're influential? influential in terms of the objective, in terms of influencing positive favourability towards the movement. I think the point I'm trying to make here, and the job today is not just to get this filled out with lots of post-it notes. I'm trying to show you a way of breaking down audiences. But what I would say is that it's a continuum. This is a movable, flexible, organic type of exercise. And what you're trying to do, in most cases, not in all, but in most cases, you're trying to move audiences from this section to this section. Certainly in an organisation where influence is as important to it as it is for the Red Cross, Red Crescent. So let's start off. Let's put donor governments up there.
But wouldn't you agree that it's dangerous to put an audience...
Sorry, can you just wait for the mic? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Wouldn't you say that it's dangerous to put an audience as one group? I mean, because the hesitation you saw in this room is that it all depends on what government you are talking about. Some are highly interested in what we are doing, others couldn't care less, probably.
It's an excellent point, yeah, absolutely. I think if you were doing this in your own day-to-day jobs, you would each need to break one of these down probably into another 5 or 10 pieces, certainly. As I said, the exercise is more to show you the technique rather than to discuss the detail and content, but you're absolutely right. The important thing is to segment as far as you possibly can until it feels like, to the recipient of your communication, that you're speaking to them absolutely directly. So that's a very good point. Let's have a look at development governments. Where would we place those on the grid? Any suggestions?
Low influence, low interest.
Low interest and low influence. Okay. Media. Scary media. Top right. Highly influential, highly interested, depending on what type of media you're talking about, again, because, as the gentleman rightly said, you need to break these each down into many, many governing boards. Just as important? Have we got any that we think might fit into this low influence but high interest?
This is not a response to that.
Or where should we put... Okay, let's ask the question another way. Where should we put you?
Well, your stuff being your team members.
Absolutely, your team members. I would say probably somewhere around here. Would you agree? Depending on their level. So anyway, that's the principle is the principle is there, and the most important thing about this chart is what you do next. And the chart hasn't been completely copied over for some reason on the PowerPoint, but you treat each of these quadrants differently. So this chart not only enables you to segment your audience, but it also enables you to understand what to do with them. The top left-hand corner, they need to be kept satisfied. It's more of a maintenance program that needs to go on here. They're highly influential. Well, they're highly influential and they've got no interest. So, you know, to get them over to this section, they're going to need some pretty exciting stuff. On the right-hand side, this is the group that you need to manage closely. You need to ensure that you're maintaining their interest and you're maintaining the influence that they have over your message. Now, sometimes the influence may be negative, in which case you may not want them to have a highly influential relationship. You may want their influence actually to be reduced. You may wish to keep their interest high, but you may wish to reduce the influence that they have over a message if it's having a negative impact. And that will also determine, therefore, the type of communication that you choose to use. The group on the right-hand corner, the low influence, high interest group, these guys need to be kept informed. They're never going to set the world on fire. They're never going to cause you a huge amount of damage, but they're latent interest has the ability to create advocates, has the ability for them to preach the message beyond their own spheres. And the group in the left-hand corner, those need monitoring, keeping happy, and ensuring that they're not going to cause you any difficulties or troubles in the future. On the reverse of the sheet, you'll see that there's another way of looking at audiences called the familiarity favourability grid. And that's just another way of breaking down audiences. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail because the principle is very similar to influence and interest. It's a way of plotting audiences and breaking down and segmenting audiences as part of this preparation phase. So the other question to ask in terms of the preparation is how many messages do I want to give? So let's play messaging maths. Have we got any mathematicians in the room? Or any accountants? Or anybody from the finance department? No? Okay. Okay, we'll have to rely on whatever maths brains we have in the room.
Umed is from finance.
Ah, stand up, the guy from finance. Give us a wave. Hello, finance. You'll be perfect at this. I'm absolutely sure you'll be great at this. So, 9 times 1, please. Wait for the mic.
For me, it's 9.
9? Yeah, any other suggestions? 3? Okay. 9. 3. Any other suggestions? Remember, this is messaging maths. This isn't normal maths. I think you might be, both of you might be trying to play normal maths. This is messaging maths. The answer to that question is actually 0. What about 3 times 1? Man from finance. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Fullman. 3 times 1. Let's have a guess. 1. 0. Okay, you're getting better at this. The answer is actually 1. 3 times 3. 2. I heard a 2 somewhere. 0. And I thought you were getting this. Okay, the answer is actually 3. I'll explain what we're getting at here. 9 messages repeated once is likely to result in none being remembered. 3 messages, each repeated once, is likely to result in one of them being remembered. The ideal, the optimum number of messages to use in any situation is that magic 3, but the other magic 3 is the number of times that message needs to be repeated, which is why 3 messages repeated 3 times results in all 3 messages being remembered. And that's a really, really important thing to remember in terms of the way that you communicate in meetings, the number of key messages you want to get into any communication situation, whether it's a meeting, a face-to-face, a press release, a white paper, an article for a newspaper, an interview. Focus on 3 messages, repeat them 3 times. That's possibly one of the most beneficial pieces of advice that, as a communications trainer, I can give you. And all too often, as communicators, we want to try and get everything into our piece of communication. And what ends up happening is that nothing gets heard and nothing gets understood. So this is absolutely key. The second point on planning your message is knowing your message inside and out. You should be able to interrogate yourself and be able to answer any single question about the message, about one of those 3 messages that you're putting out at any one time. And the final thing is that remember there are key messages and there are secondary messages. And don't get them confused. These 3 key messages will all have at some point sub-messages. But make sure that you stick to 3 key messages only in any one single piece of communication. So, going back to what we said at the beginning, the audience that you're speaking to has needs as well. If I go and talk to a guy whose needs are ego-driven, which may very well be the case for a number of people in this room. If you're going to speak to a donor who's driven by ego, he wants everybody in the world to know about his donation, and you go and talk to him about the fantastic work of the Red Cross, and you go into all the elements of the humanitarian policies, and you go into all of the elements of the organisational development, the history of the organisation, other people that have donated in the past, and you get too much into the detail of what you want to say, and you miss out the fact that actually what he wants is his name in lights, or his name on your press release, then you'll have lost the battle, the communications battle with that individual. So make sure that you understand precisely what the needs are of your audience that you're speaking to, and be prepared to have the evidence there at your fingertips. And an organisation like this has an enormous library of data and research to draw upon to find the evidence and to find the proof points for your messages. We've already discussed a lot about stakeholder groups and how to map them. You've got another piece of paper in your booklets, which I won't go through now, but by all means, take this back to your offices and work on this individually. But this just gives you another way of thinking about stakeholders and how to break them down during the planning process by what they're thinking now and how they're behaving now, and the shift that you want to create in the communication and behaviour. The next tool, the next tip, is to make sure that your communication has a story built around it. Make sure that there's a solid introduction, make sure that there's a compelling midsection to that story, and make sure that there's a close to that story. And you know, a lot of communication borrows its techniques from the world of sales. Do you understand what I mean by that? Does that make sense? A lot of sales is about introducing a concept, elaborating upon that concept, and then closing the deal. And communications is much the same. So, for example, if I'm meeting Jason and I want to elicit a donation from Jason, or I want Jason's company to support the Red Cross, I could go to Jason and I could say, "Hi Jason, very nice to meet you. Thank you for inviting me. Now let me show you my PowerPoint slides. I've got 30 slides to go through, and I'm sure that somewhere within that your questions will be answered, and you'll understand why we're having this meeting. You'll understand what the communication is all about, and you'll probably buy from me at the end, or you'll agree. You'll be influenced by the communication." Can anyone see anything wrong with that approach? I hope some people can see something wrong with that approach.
Should ask the questions first.
Exactly. Ask the questions. And this whole next section is about active listening and asking questions. So it'd be far better if I went and I said, "Hi Jason, very nice to meet you. I had a meeting with one of your colleagues last week, and during the meeting we established that you're working on a really interesting CSR program. You're doing a really interesting job with corporate and social responsibility. So tell me a bit more about that. Tell me about the charitable work that you're doing. I hear you're doing great stuff, and I'd love to work with you on that, but I can't really do that until I know some more." That type of opening is likely to have a far better response than me opening up my flip chart or opening up my laptop and being about to do death by PowerPoint, which is often the approach that's taken. So, question throughout your communication, especially during the midsection, when you're wanting Jason to elaborate on his CSR program so that you can find where the opportunities are for your message and for your influence. And there's that phrase at the bottom which is, "keep up the whiffing." Does anybody know what the whiffing might mean? It's a sales and marketing term. It stands for "what's in it for me." And it's the most important thing to remember when you're trying to influence another party. What's in it for me? If I'm driven by ego, it's my face on the front of the Red Cross magazine. If I'm driven by desires to be involved in humanitarian activity, then it's the feeling that I get as a person, and the communication needs to be able to do that for me. So always ask yourself, what's in it for the person that you're speaking to? Also, ask them to visualize. One of the best ways to get people to remember bits of communication is if they experience it. There's actually been some research done that says that you're 9 times more likely to remember a message if you've experienced it yourself. And one of the easiest ways to get somebody to remember a message through visualization and through experience is to get them to imagine. And you can say to people in conversation, you know, just imagine, Jason, what it would be like if we were working together. Just imagine how potent your message, or how much more potent your message as a business would be if you were working with the Red Cross. Just imagine what that might look like. And by trying to get Jason to paint pictures in his mind of what the relationship might look like, he's actively experiencing, he's actively engaging and actively experiencing the communication for himself. And the close of your communication has to be much like a sales pitch close. Recap the salient points. Ask Jason, have we answered your question? Have we covered all of your objections? Have we proven to Jason that his with him, his what's in it for me will be catered for? And have we created a call to action? Have I said to Jason, Jason, that was a really great meeting. I'm really pleased that we understood where we are on the same page. I'm really glad that we can both see benefits of working together. Should we set a date for another meeting in 4 weeks' time? Without that call to action, all of your hard work in doing the communication may have been pointless. And then finally leave with a close, with a solid handshake and a solid commitment to continuing the relationship and continuing the communication. The last section is all about delivery and impact, and a lot of what I was just speaking about touches on that. But again, there have been lots of surveys, and there are probably lots of surveys that say that too many surveys are a bad idea, but there are some very interesting numbers that have been, and very interesting bits of research that have been done in communications. And in terms of the communication makeup, words, the actual content, only accounts for 7%. Less than 10% of the impact that you have on somebody is attributable to the words and the content that you use. The tone that you use is likely to account for somewhere between 38 and, in fact, another study by London University said it could be as much as 44-45%. And body language is around 55%. That means that 93% of communication is not about what you say, but how you say it. People remember, here's some more numbers, people remember 20% of what they hear and 80% of what they see. And as I said earlier, they remember 8 times more if they've got a related experience that's related to the communication. And an audience will decide in under 30 seconds, in 27 seconds, how much of their attention you deserve. First impressions are taken up by the first 4 seconds. They then verify that first impression within the next 5 to 15 seconds. And by 15 seconds, if they haven't decided that they're going to listen to you and be communicated with, they're starting to zone out. And I had my watch going at the very beginning of this session to see whether that was happening. If you lose somebody in communications, it then takes another 21 positive experiences to get them back. That's an incredible number of subsequent positive experiences that somebody needs to have to be able for you as a communicator to be able to recover. I'm sure you get the point. The point is that first impressions are absolutely critical to your communication. And again, that's in terms of whether you're speaking in public like this or whether you're writing a press release and looking at the first headline or the first few lines of your press release. I know that my son, my 9-year-old son, certainly reacts in this way. I need to make sure that when I'm getting him to, or I'm trying to get him to stop pulling the dog's ears or his tail, or I'm trying to get him to sit down, those first few words and that first interaction is what will decide whether he will actually allow the dog to live another day or come and eat his dinner. So I think these, as I said at the beginning, a lot of these skills are transferable across your personal life as well as your professional life. Let's just take a quick look as we start to wrap up about listening and what active listening actually means. There's the 80-20 rule, which means that 80% of your time should be spent doing this, and only 20% of your time should be spent talking. When you're communicating with your own audiences, I urge you to engage in active listening. And there's a process. There's a very simple 4-step process, which says question, rephrase the answer that you get from the person that you're communicating in the language in which they've phrased the question, respond to the question, and then progress. So if I'm asking Jason a question, I might say, Jason, why do you think it would be a great idea to work with, why do you think it would be a great idea for your business to work with the IFRC? And Jason might come back and say, well, you know, because we already do a lot of work with charities and we can see the benefit to our organisation. So I might then rephrase that question and say, rephrase that answer and say, oh, that's interesting. So charities are an important part of your overall business strategy, Jason. And Jason may say, yes, that's right. Jason has to say yes, to be quite honest, because all I've done is rephrased his question, right? And by Jason saying yes and getting into the yes zone, which is where we want any piece of communication to result, we want everybody in the yes zone, because the more people are saying yes throughout the conversation, even if you're asking them their name and you're repeating it to them 5 times, the process is all about getting somebody to say yes. The more that Jason gets into the yes zone, the more likely he is to be influenced by my communication. So I've rephrased his response, and then that gives me a nice way to progress through the communication and the conversation. Another tip is to hear and see yourself from 3 angles. Of course, you have to see yourself from your own perspective. How am I doing? How am I performing? Is my shirt undone? Are my shoelaces undone? Have I got clean shoes? You know, how am I doing as a communicator? You have to also see things from your audience's perspective. So as I've been going through this conversation, I've been continually thinking, well, what are they thinking of me? Are they reacting? Are they hearing the words? Are the words meaning anything? Who shook their head? No, good. And then finally, there's a third perspective that you need to look from, which is a neutral perspective. You have to think about, if I was the camera up there filming this experience, what would that picture look like? And similar to the 80-20 rule, 80% is not about looking from your own perspective, it's about looking from another perspective, from your audience's perspective and from this neutral perspective. Has anybody in the room had any experience of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming? 1, 2? A few people around the room, myself included. Within NLP and common psychological wisdom, there's a belief that humans fit into 3 categories in terms of the ways that they communicate and the ways that they experience the world. And these 3 things are kinesthetic, which is people who base their communication and who experience the world through what they feel, through their emotions, through what they sense. People are visual, those that experience the world through pictures. They have very strong memories that are very picture-based. And again, they experience the world through, and they form their opinions based on what they see, but they also express themselves in terms of what they see. And aural, people who are more affected by hearing and by sounds and those sorts of things. So let's just have a quick look at a couple of comments and see which categories these fit into. I feel that this was the best 60-minute training session I've ever attended. I'm excited to try out my newfound communication skills. What do we think? Which one of those three does that fit into? Anybody? The first one, it's kinesthetic. Absolutely. Next one. It painted an excellent picture of how to communicate with impact, and I now see clearly what I need to do. I think you can probably see a little bit of a pattern emerging here. And finally, I hear exactly what you're talking about. It sounds like great advice. Now, any one of those three, the content of any one of those three sentences could have been expressed in any one of those three different ways. As a communicator, especially if you understand your audience, and if you've asked sufficient questions to get a response so that you know which of those characteristics your audience is going to display, especially if you've got a one-to-one conversation or one-to-one dialogue going on. NLP says, neuro-linguistic programming says, that if you're able to match your communication style to that of your recipient, you're more than 20 times more likely to have your communication achieve what it needs to achieve. And I guess that makes sense. Makes perfect sense, because if a chap is talking to me, if a guy is talking to me in language that I use and that is familiar and common to me, the chances are I'm going to think it's one of us, just like me. Yeah, I can do business with this guy. So it's very important to try and understand which of those categories your recipient, the recipient of your communication, fits into. It's not always possible, because often if you're writing a press release or you're doing a remote piece of communication, you won't always know the answer to this question. But if you're doing one-to-one communication between you and one other person, or you and several other people, by questioning and by actively listening to their responses, you're able to identify which of these three categories your recipients will fit into. The last couple of slides are really about personal presentation style and personal communication style. The importance of voice, the importance of body language. In terms of voice, if you're using the telephone a lot to communicate, which I guess all of us do to some extent or other, even with email these days, in terms of impact and influence of your tone, of your vocal tone, often if you're on the telephone, that's all the other person has to go on, especially if it's the first time you've ever communicated with them. And voice will account, the vocal tone will account for 84% of the impact of that conversation. If you're in face-to-face situations like this, then vocal tone accounts for 38% of the impact that you're having on your audience. Still extremely high in terms of all the other factors that there are that make up communication. And then there are several aspects of different tones, different tonality within the voice that add to or detract or subtract from the communication impact that you're having. A deep voice is considered to be wise and sage-like and considered and strategic. CEOs are often taught in vocal coaching to drop the tonality of their voice. Margaret Thatcher, when she first came to power in the UK, surrounded by men in Parliament, first female Prime Minister the UK has seen, surrounded by an all-male cabinet in a very, very male-dominated political environment at the time, felt the only way that she was going to be able to achieve what she needed to was to be able to look like, to some extent, and talk like, to a large extent, her male colleagues. Now, whether you agree or disagree with the gender politics of that situation is not the point. The point is that she was extremely successful in lowering her voice to make sure that she was part of those with whom she was communicating with, number one, and to make sure that she did have the air of authority the air of wisdom, the air of safety and strategy that she needed to be able to achieve her aims as Prime Minister. A mid-range voice is often seen as creative, energetic. It's what entrepreneurs use. And a high-pitched voice can be seen as frivolous, fun, not terribly serious, not always terribly engaging, sometimes a little bit annoying. So there are places for each of these. And the best users of voice, the best communicators, are able actually to choose which level of voice they're going to use for any particular piece of communication, and they're able to vary the tone of their voice according to the content that they're speaking about at any one time. And there are lots of exercises. We've got a vocal coach who works with Pinnacle, who, if you ever, for whatever reason, get a chance to spend an afternoon with, I can guarantee you it will be the most hilarious 2 hours that you've ever spent with a trainer, because it consists of all sorts of doing very, very strange things with your voices. But the outcome is that people who are properly vocally trained are able to inject colour and personality into their voice by varying the style, by varying the speed, by varying the pace, and by varying the pitch of their voices according to the communication that they're delivering. And the final thing on this slide is breathing and pausing. And just like questioning, breathing and pausing during communication is vital, because it's the opportunity that you get to be able to give your audience a chance to inject a little bit of information of their own. It also enables you to chunk bits of information and bits of content within a sentence or within a piece of communication into bite-sized, manageable pieces for your audience to understand. And it also gives you a chance to reflect and consider what you're saying, so that you're able to take that opportunity to see things from the other side, to be able to see things from that neutral position. And without breathing and pausing, your communication, certainly your personal communication, has little pace other than just a railroad train that's running through without much meaning or sense. So that's voice. What about our bodies? In terms of personal communication, in terms of one-to-one communication, eyes are the most important part of the body. And there's something called the aura effect, which works very well in situations like this, which is, I, as a presenter, want each and every one of you to feel that I'm communicating with you personally. I haven't spent a great deal of time during this conversation looking at any one person. I've spent the time scanning the room in the hope that most of you feel that you've had my eye contact sufficiently to know that I'm interested in you and I want you to be engaged with me. So what I do whilst I'm presenting, what I encourage everybody here to do if they're presenting to large groups of people, is to scan the room, not starting on the front row, going to the second row, going to the third row, going to the fourth row, and finally ending up at the fifth row. Sorry, Susie, I left you out. But to aim your sight somewhere in the centre to the back of the room, because the aura effect says that if I'm aiming in that direction, the likelihood is that the front two rows are going to get the benefit of that vision anyway, and the rear two rows are going to get the benefit of that vision. So when you're communicating with large groups of people, it's beneficial to scan the room, but to pitch somewhere in the centre of the crowd. If you're individually glancing at people for more than 3 or 4 seconds, it's going to say one of several things. It's either going to look extremely aggressive, and you're going to end up with the person that you're communicating with being extremely off-put and looking away, thank you. Or you're going to have some kind of creepy, especially if there's a male staring at a female for 1, 3 or 4 seconds, then you're going to have a slightly creepy thing going on that none of us really want to get into. But the point is that you should aim not to spend too much time focusing on any one person whilst you're communicating. The other thing is that the rest of the room can feel very left out, not part of your party if you're if you're enjoying too much communication with one person in the room. And moving around is fine. There's a lot of contradictory advice about moving during presentations. A lot of people say that you should stand rooted, feet on the ground, to attention, doing this. I personally, I can't do that. And I don't know a lot of presenters that do that terribly well. And I don't think there's any problem with moving. I don't think there's any problem with hand gestures, provided they're appropriate to the content and to the communication. And our advice always, when we're talking about personal communication style and personal presentation style, is just to be as relaxed and natural as you possibly can be. This should just be a conversation. A conversation with lots of active listening and all of the other great things that we've spoken about so far. But it is a conversation. It's about building relationship and building a rapport with an audience. And finally, overcoming objections. Now, so we've started our communication, we've introduced, we've done lots of active listening, lots of active questioning throughout our communication. But inevitably, we face objections when we communicate with people. And Jason says to me, you know what, I really don't want to be involved in working with the IFRC, not because I don't think you're a great organisation, because I think you are a fantastic organisation and you do great work and you get extremely good exposure and there's a generally good feeling about the organisation. It's not for those reasons. Unless I've actually asked Jason why it is, I'm never going to find out what his objections actually are. And objections tend to fall into a number of categories. Either they're genuine concerns, which are utterly inflexible. Jason's board has taken a decision that there is no more money available and no more support available for any external organisations. It's a board decision, it's written into corporate policy, we're not going to change that. But we need to know that. We need to know that that is the case. There are regular concerns that need to be overcome before you can achieve the desired outcome. Concerns that can be overcome, but again, unless you've done your active listening and active questioning, you're never going to know that. And then there are the devil's advocate, the testing objections, to test the position. Designed to text a position. Always spell check your PowerPoint document before you send it over for delivery. But that should have said designed to test a position. I'm sure you understand what we're supposed to be saying there. And you need to identify which of these the objections fall into. If they are anything other than the first one, then objections are actually relatively easy to overcome. You say to the person you're communicating with, I understand that objection, let's just put that to one side. And assuming that I can overcome that, is everything else okay, broadly speaking? Broadly speaking, is everything else within the communication that I've just given you going to get you to do what I want you to do? Is everything else, broadly speaking, going to influence you in the way that I want you to be influenced? And if Jason comes back and says, well, no, actually, there's another thing. Okay, Jason, let's just put that to one side with the first thing that we put to one side. Is there anything else that needs to be overcome? And then you get a very clear idea and understanding of where your communication needs to go next. And more often than not, your communication then just needs to face those objections and overcome those objections to enable you to then say to Jason, right, Jason, you said to me that those were the only two things that you were then concerned about. I've overcome those objections, so then I'm assuming, based on the fact that you've already told me that everything else was okay, I'm assuming that the course of action that I'm suggesting can now take place. That's pure sales pitch closing. And whether you're pitching a story to a journalist, as I've done thousands of times throughout my career, or whether you're negotiating with a car salesman, which thankfully I haven't needed to do too many times during my life, you will see that the same behaviour is displayed. That closing technique of finding out what objections are, moving them to one side, establishing whether everything else is okay, and then moving on. Classic sales pitch closing, and a key part of communication. So, just to summarise and to finish off, 3 points, 3 main things that you should remember about this presentation that I'd like you to take away and use in your everyday communication lives. Number 1, listen actively. Hopefully I've said that now at least 3 times. I think I've probably said it a few more than 3 times. Know your audience and your message. Understand who it is that you're talking to, the patterns of speech, the patterns of language that they use, but critically, absolutely critically, what their needs are from your communication. And finally, make sure that you take the opportunity to see yourself as others see you, by looking at yourself from your audience's perspective, by looking at yourself from a neutral perspective and continually switching your behaviour and continually switching the perspective that you look at your communications situational. And I hope that this has been useful. I hope that you'll take the learning and take some of these tools and tips away with you, and I hope this will help you to improve your communications and to become better communicators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're actually a few minutes ahead of schedule. We want to be sensitive to people's time. But while we have Neil with...
I wonder if you could give some advice, certainly in our field, in logistics, about a new group that we're having to deal with, where the plan, the sales pitch, will be very difficult, and that is the military. Increasingly we see the military involved in humanitarian actions, and really some of these concepts go a little bit out of the window because of issues in terms of a common understanding, a common altruistic approach and values and so on. I wonder if you have any tips for how to suddenly have to change your pitch when you're coming across a stakeholder with whom you're really not that familiar dealing with.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. It all comes down to their needs. I think you have to be sensitive, you have to be incredibly sensitive to the needs, as we said at the beginning, to the needs of your audience. And for you to approach communications as a two-way process, from a partnership approach rather than any kind of adversarial or conflict-based approach, which is always going to be difficult with new audiences, I should imagine, especially with the military. But the basis of any communication, and the basis of any communication skill is an understanding on both parties that there's give and take, and that there are needs. That you as an organisation have needs from your communication, that the military have needs of their own in terms of their communication and the way that they receive yours. So, and the only way to really get to that is by doing what I said at the beginning, which is asking questions, pointing out your situation. Could you give me an example of a particular case where you would need to communicate?
I think increasingly today, certainly in terms of logistics, we see where the military see themselves as having a imperative humanitarian role to play, whereby we can understand that ambition from their side, i.e. offering a service, but it is fundamentally against our principles, it's against our guidelines. But I've seen very often that humanitarians and Federation people in particular suddenly get very uncomfortable in that situation because it does challenge certain fundamentals and principles. Yet we also know that behind very often is a political agenda or indeed a military objective. And so if you're trying to negotiate something, it could be an airlift, it could be asking the military to provide something important for us like fuel, it's often ended up having to be some kind of a trade-off. So therefore it becomes a little bit of a challenge in terms of how to pitch that when you're having the meetings.
Sure, and I don't think in that sort of situation you should ever expect that there is going to be an easy solution, because there isn't. There isn't, and neither is there always going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. I think every situation will determine the type of communication that you need to engage in. But I think the only way to engage in that level of communication is to look at the objectives, to look at your objectives as an organisation, to try and understand the military's objectives in terms of what they need to achieve, and to try and find some common ground, and to try and present your case as best you possibly can. There isn't going to be a magic answer from either myself as a professional communicator, and I'm sure that the military would say the same on the other side. It just has to be about finding common ground that serves both purposes, and to try and find a mutual respect from the recipient that you're communicating with, to find a mutual respect for your aims and ambitions and objectives, as you can try to understand theirs as well. But I accept it's a very, very difficult situation. And I'm not sure that communications will, on its own, will always achieve the aim.
What you say is 7% importance, and then 93% is your body language and voice and tone. So I'm just now comparing the communication and interview to media with a job interview. So often you are called by telephone interview, and if you cannot avoid that, you have to deal with. So is there any tips or any common general comment? Because especially if you say it's only 7%, and you are not able to really communicate in terms of your body language, and probably also you cannot really maybe change your natural voice and your own character. You said that you can also, improve and to get certain skills, but in fact I think it's very challenging and difficult. So any example or tips?
Well, there are two types of telephone call. There's the telephone call where the caller and you have already met. You understand the body language that's likely to be going on the other side of the call, and that's a much easier telephone communication to deal with, where there's been a previous face-to-face or personal meeting. The cold call, the call where there has been no previous meeting, relies on a lot of the techniques that we spoke about at the beginning, in terms of you can still use the telephone to question, and you can still use the telephone call to understand which modality the caller is in, whether they're kinesthetic, aural, or visual, based on the type of language that they deliver to you over the phone. And you can still respond in that kind of language, in that sympathetic language style. I would say that when you're on the phone, because the voice is so much more important, there has to be a lot more colour in your voice, which is why people have telephone voices. And which is why it's sometimes hilarious hearing somebody's telephone voice and hearing how different it is from the voice that they will use as soon as they put down the receiver and turn to you and start having a conversation. But that's there for a reason. That telephone voice is there for a reason. It's because you're using your voice to impart some information about yourself and your character in the absence of having your body language to do it. So to answer your question, I would say that it's absolutely fine, and you shouldn't make apologies for having a telephone voice, and for ensuring that the voice has different levels of tonality, that it has different pitches, and that your communication is delivered in a different way to that when you're making personal presentations. So don't apologise for having a telephone voice.
Job interview is also maybe comparable with media interview, one of those maybe also things where you have to be also trained. So maybe for our HR and other colleagues, maybe to get another maybe series of lecture on that academic network to get some kind of advice and training would maybe be good on that as well.
Absolutely. I have a question about email etiquette, because we're talking about communications, and a large bit of our communicating with each other in-house and with our partners and key stakeholders, at least initially, is through email. Do you have any guidance on that? And the reason I bring this up is we all got BlackBerries. About a month ago, this became part of the culture of the Secretariat. So now when you're talking to people in face-to-face communication, you're going, yes, that's, no, well, yeah, exactly. And so we're not actively listening anymore. Second, because we now have this, the increased traffic and the use of reply all of these different functions in it, does increase the email quite a bit. And I was wondering if as part of your communication package, you do address these kind of issues.
We do. When we do a 2-day communication course, and email and digital communication is a large part of that. And you know, a lot of it is very culture bound. A lot of the etiquette is bound in the culture of an organisation. So what is appropriate to one organisation will not be appropriate in another. I think that there's a general level of understanding that whilst somebody is speaking, and that whilst whether it's a presentation or in a face-to-face meeting, there is a generally accepted wisdom that that crackberry addiction should not be taking place at that time. There's a general perception still that phones should be switched off and placed in pockets during important meetings and important conversations. It's something that we advise all of our clients to do. There's a cultural thing also in terms of nationalities. The Americans, the Americans seem far less sensitive to this than Europeans. And so I think you need to be aware of cultural and regional sensitivities, but also the cultural the cultural mores of the organisation that you're talking about. Number one. Number two, in terms of the reply and reply all situation, again, it's very culture bound. I was doing some work about 4 years ago. I was working in Israel 3 days a week, in London 1 day a week, and in Ramallah in the West Bank on occasion as well. And between those 3 places I saw entirely different responses to reply all. The Israelis wouldn't reply all to anybody, no matter how many people were on distribution list. You know, the communication was very much about a one-to-one. My only concern is actually in you, because you're the only guy that's going to deliver what I want. And everybody else in the room, you know, frankly, they're just peripheral, and I don't want to burden them. I found that when I was working in the Netherlands, actually, it was even more stark. The reply all syndrome in the Netherlands. Everybody got copied in on absolutely everything. To the extent that I, having come from an environment that was very much different to that, had to say to my colleagues, look, you really don't have to do this. And in my own business, I encourage all of my staff to try and be to try and be as careful as they can about who they include in reply lists and reply all lists. But it is very culture bound. It's very organisational bound. So again, there isn't a one size fits all solution. You can often take your cues from the person that you're communicating with based on who they've reply-alled or not. So yeah, you need to exercise a certain amount of sensitivity. The one thing that I would say about email communication is that a lot of people mistake email communication for being an ability to write your memoirs. Because quite often when you're replying on email, the temptation is to write down absolutely everything that you would never say to a person face to face, regardless of whether it's personal or otherwise. And so, and the most impactful email communication tends to be the shortest. So for example, in our own business, when we're sending out emails, when we're sending out prospecting emails to potential clients, the email is rarely more than 6 or 7 sentences. The temptation is to send them the course brochure, to send them every one of our 93 courses on email, to talk to them about our last 5 case studies and throw the kitchen sink at them and talk about the strategy work that we do and the capacity building work that we do and the training work that we do. And this isn't a pitch, by the way. And that's the temptation with email, because it's so easy to do. It's not easy to receive, though. That's the problem. It's not easy to receive lengthy communication by email. So I'd make email communication as short and sharp as you possibly can, to the point. And I wouldn't... A lot of people also make the mistake of including everything that's in the attachment that they're sending in the body copy of the email. which kind of makes you think, well, why have they attached the document in the first place? So I think you need to be fairly judicious about the way that you write and deliver emails.